Section 5 of From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Bacon, Josephine Dodge Dascom. American, 1876 through blank. Even while at Smith College, Josephine Dodge Dascom was noted for her cleverness and originality. Before she graduated in 1898, she had had work published in the magazines. Mrs. Bacon had 3 children whose bringing up she considers the most important thing in her life. She loves children, gardening, making preserves, and raising pigs. Important works: Biography of a Baby, The Imp and the Angel, On Our Hill, Smith College Stories. Bailey, Caroline Sherwin. American, 1877 through blank. Caroline Sherwin Bailey is a beloved kindergarten teacher of New York. She taught in the kindergartens of the public schools and at one time, while engaged in this work, lived at the Warren Goddard Settlement in New York. Here she led story groups and studied the story needs of the children. For a long time she was editor of the juvenile department of the Delineator. Now she devotes her entire time to writing, lecturing, and giving courses in storytelling. Important works: Firelight Stories, For the Children's Hour, For the Storyteller, Stories Children Need, Tell Me Another Story. Barnum, Phineas T. American, 1810 through 1891. On the 5th of July, 1810, heralded by the mighty thundering of cannon, a rattling of drums, and all the other noises of Independence Day, there appeared for the first time on this world's stage a small boy named Phineas T. Barnum, who was destined to become the greatest showman in all the world, and to make a bigger stir, both in America and Europe, than all the Independence Days put together. Phineas was born in the town of Bethel, Connecticut. His father was a tailor, a farmer, and sometimes a tavern keeper, and Phineas led the life of an ordinary country boy, driving the cows to pasture, shelling corn, weeding the garden, and riding the horse which led the ox team in plowing. But the boy liked better to work with his head than with his hands, and he was always figuring out ways and means of earning money. On holidays, especially those days when the soldiers marched out and trained on the greens with scores of country folk looking on, days when other boys were riotously spending all their hoarded pennies, Phineas was busy earning money. With bustling industry he peddled molasses candy, home-made gingerbread, cookies and sugar candies among the crowd, thus generally finding himself richer at the end of the holiday by many a merry penny. As Phineas grew up he tried to keep a country store. A jolly place it was, where in the evenings and on rainy days all the wits and wags of the village gathered to sit around the stove and talk or play jokes on one another, for all his life long Phineas dearly loved a joke. But keeping store was by no means in Phineas's line. He was only moderately successful, and it was not until he was 25 years old, married and with a little daughter of his own, that he found the work for which he was really fitted. This work was nothing more or less than providing people with clean and wholesome amusement. In 1835 Barnum heard of a remarkable Negro woman named Joyce Heth, who was said to be 161 years old, and to have been the nurse of George Washington. She was a dried-up little old creature, looking almost like a mummy, with a head of bushy, thick gray hair. She lay stiff on a couch and could not move her limbs. Nevertheless, she was pert and sociable, and would talk as long as anyone would converse with her. It was said that she had lain for years in an outhouse on the estate of a certain John S. Bowling in Virginia, having been there so long that nobody knew or cared how old she was, until one day Mr. Bowling accidentally discovered an old bill of sale describing this woman as having been sold by Augustine Washington, father of George, to his half-sister Elizabeth Atwood. Being greatly interested in Joyce, Barnum sold out his store for $500, and with this little capital he started out to exhibit her. He saw in the very beginning of his career that everything depended on getting the public excited and interested to think and talk of what he had to exhibit. Accordingly, he made great use of advertisements in newspapers and every other means to arouse public interest. As a result, his showrooms in New York, Boston, Albany, and elsewhere were thronged, and he earned a vast return on his money. Joyce would prattle away garrulously about her dear little George, meaning George Washington, and she would tell how she had been present at the birth of the Father of his country, and had been the one to put the very first clothes on the dear little infant. Often people would ask her questions about the Washington family, and she would answer all, and was never caught in a single contradiction. When interest in the old woman appeared to flag, Barnum secretly caused the newspapers to agitate the question whether she was not, after all, a mere automaton and no living woman, a made image that talked and moved by means of machinery and springs. Then more crowds of people flocked to the hall to find out the truth about her. Barnum's next venture after Joyce Heth was an Italian juggler who performed certain remarkable feats of balancing, plate spinning, and stilt walking. This man called himself Signor Antonio, and had once traveled with a monkey and a hand organ in Italy. But Barnum induced him first to take a bath, and then to take upon himself the much more imposing name of Signor Vivala. By dint of much advertising, he then made Vivala very popular, and so remarkable was Barnum's ability to turn everything, even criticism, to good account, that he won his greatest success with Vivala by making good use of a hiss of derision that greeted one of Signor's appearances from the audience. Far from being downcast by this hiss, Barnum sought out the one who had made the contemptuous noise, and found him to be one Roberts, a circus performer, who insisted that he could do all Vivala had done and more. Immediately Barnum challenged Roberts to hold a contest with Vivala, offering $1,000 prize to the winner. He then advertised the trial of skill far and wide until he got the public interest at a white heat, thus drawing packed houses both for the first and following contests. In April 1836, Barnum contracted for himself and Vivala to join Aaron Turner's traveling circus company. Barnum himself was to act as ticket seller, secretary, and treasurer. Mr. Turner was an old showman, but to Barnum this traveling and performing in canvas tents was altogether new. For centuries, in England, dwarfs, giants, and wild men had been popular, and there had been shows of jugglers, performing horses, dancing bears, feats of horsemanship, acrobats, rope dancers, etc., at fairs and elsewhere. Indeed, an ancient hand-illumined Anglo-Saxon manuscript shows an audience in an arena or amphitheater built during the Roman occupation of Britain, diverted by a musician, a dancer, and a trained bear, while Shakespeare, in Love's Labour's Lost, refers to a famous performing horse of his day. Rope dancers threw somersaults over naked swords and men's heads in the days of Charles II, and Joseph Clark, the original boneless man, appeared in the age of James II, while George Washington and his staff attended a circus performance in Philadelphia in 1780. But the regular tenting circus that traveled about with wagons had not come into being either in England or America until sometime between the years 1805 and 1830. At first these circuses were very small and modest exhibitions, met only at fairs, and they performed only in the daytime, because no means had been discovered for lighting the tent at night. But when, in 1830, the methods of lighting the rings with candles in a frame around the center pole was devised, the circus began to grow. Turner's circus, with which Barnum first traveled, was a moderate-sized show, and they set forth with quite a train of wagons, carriages, horses, and ponies, a band of music, and about 25 men. Their tour was very successful for all concerned, but in the fall Barnum took friendly leave of Turner, and with several wagons, a small canvas tent, and such performers as Vivala, James Sanford, a Negro singer and dancer, several musicians, and Joe Pentland, one of the cleverest and most original of clowns, he began a little traveling exhibition of his own. In Camden, South Carolina, Sanford suddenly deserted the company, and as Mr. Barnum had advertised Negro songs at his performance, he was obliged to black his own face and hands, go on the stage, and sing the advertised songs himself. To his surprise, he was roundly applauded. But when in the Negro black he hurried out after one of these performances to uphold some of his men against a white man who was abusing them, the fiery Southerner, taking him in truth for a Negro, drew his pistol and shouted, "You black rascal, how dare you use such language to a white man?" Only the greatest presence of mind, which prompted Barnum to roll up his sleeve in a twinkling and reveal his own white skin, saved him from a bullet. In going from Columbus, Georgia, to Montgomery, Alabama, Barnum's company was obliged to cross a thinly settled, desolate tract known as the Indian Nation, and as several persons had been murdered there by hostile Indians, it was deemed dangerous to travel the road without an escort. Only the day before, the stagecoach had been held up in that region. The circus men were all well armed, however, and trusted that their numbers would seem too formidable to be attacked, but they said quite openly that they earnestly wished there was no need to run the risk. Vivalla alone declared himself to be fearless, and loudly boasted that he was ready to encounter 50 Indians and drive them all into the swamp. Accordingly, when the party had safely passed over the entire route and within 14 miles of Montgomery, and they were beyond the reach of danger, Joe Pentland, the clown, determined to test Vivalla's much boasted bravery. Pentland had secretly purchased an old Indian dress with a fringed hunting shirt and moccasins, and these he put on after coloring his face with Spanish brown. Then, shouldering his musket, he followed Vivalla and his party, and approaching stealthily, he leaped into their midst with a terrific war-whoop. Barnum and Vivalla's other companions were all in the secret, and they instantly fled, leaving the doughty hero alone with the foe. Without much ado, Vivalla took to his heels and ran like a deer. Pentland followed him, yelling horribly and brandishing his gun. After running a full mile, the hero, out of breath and frightened nearly out of his wits, dropped on his knees before his pursuer and begged for his life. The Indian leveled his gun at his victim, but soon seemed to relent, and signified that Vivalla should turn his pockets inside out. This he did, handing over to Pentland a purse containing $11. The savage then marched Vivalla to an oak, and with his handkerchief tied him in the most approved Indian manner to the tree. After this, Pentland joined Barnum and the others, and as soon as he had washed his face and changed his dress, they all went to the rescue of Vivalla. The little Italian was overjoyed to see them coming, but the very moment that he was released, he began to swagger about again, swearing that after his companions had fled, the one Indian who had first attacked them had been reinforced by 6 more. He had defended himself stoutly, he said, but the superior force of the 7 huge braves had at last compelled him to surrender. For a week the party pretended to believe Vivalla's big story, but at the end of that time they told him the truth, and Joe Pentland showed him his purse, desiring to return it. Inwardly, Vivalla must have been deeply chagrined, but outwardly he flatly refused to believe the story, and stubbornly said that he would not take back the $11, insisting that the money could not possibly be his, since his purse had been taken, not by one Indian, but by 7. Now, at length, Barnum began to long earnestly for some more settled and worthwhile phase of the show business. It happened at just this time that the American Museum in New York City was for sale at a moderate price, for the reason that it had not been run for some time past so as to make any money. It was a fine collection of curiosities, and Barnum determined to buy it, though the price, low as it was enormous in comparison with the small amount of capital which he had been able so far to lay by. He had the most eager confidence, however, that he could manage the museum so as to make it pay large returns, and he had the courage to stake all that he had on his own enterprise, wit, and ability. Accordingly, he offered to pay down all he possessed and to make enough out of the museum to pay the rest within a set space of time, agreeing that if he could not do so, he should forfeit not only the museum, but the whole amount that he had thus far paid. So he found himself at last in possession of a valuable and instructive as well as amusing collection, well worthy that he should devote to it all his wonderful energies. There were all sorts of rare beasts and remarkably trained animals, from performing dogs to performing fleas, these latter only to be seen with their tiny carriages and outfits through a magnifying glass. There were giants, dwarfs, jugglers, ventriloquists, rope dancers, gypsies, albinos, and remarkable mechanical figures. Mr. Barnum banished all the poor and vulgar things which so frequently disfigured other performances of this kind, and devoted himself, heart and soul, to giving the public the best and cleanest performance to be found for 25 cents anywhere in the city. He had such a remarkable understanding of human nature, and so keen and merry a wit, that he was always able to startle the public attention and keep people thinking and talking about his performances. Once he employed a man to go very solemnly and lay down 3 bricks at certain distances apart in front of the museum, then to pass as solemnly with a 4th brick in his hand from one of the 3 to another, picking up each and exchanging it for the one he held in his hand. In no time at all the mysterious doings of the brickman had attracted a huge crowd of curious humanity, trying to find out what he could possibly be about. And when at the end of every hour, according to Barnum's directions, the man walked as though still intent upon this strange business of his, into the museum, quite a little crowd of curious would march up to the ticket office and buy tickets just to enter the building and learn, if they could, the secret of his strange doings. Not only could Barnum use his wit to attract people into the museum, but he also used the same wit on occasion to get them out again. Sometimes people would come and bring their luncheons and stay all day in the building, so crowding it that others who wished to come in had to be turned away, and their 25-cent pieces thus were lost to the coffers of the museum. Once, on St. Patrick's Day, a crowd of Irish people thronged the place, giving every evidence, one and all, of intending to remain until sundown. Beholding an eager crowd without, pressing to come in, and the ticket seller forced of necessity to refuse their quarters, Barnum attempted to induce one Irish lady with 2 children to leave the place by politely showing her an egress or way out of the building through a back door into a side street. But the lady haughtily remarked that she had her dinner and intended to stay all day. Desperate then, Barnum had a sign painter paint on a large sign, "To the egress." This he placed over the steps leading to the back door, where the crowd must see it after they had once been around the whole building and seen all there was to see. Plunging down the stairs, they read, "To the egress," and not knowing at all the meaning of the word, they shouted aloud, "Sure, that's some new kind of animal." Eager to take in everything, they crowded out the door, only to find that this wonderful new curiosity was the back street. Once Barnum engaged a band of wild Indians from Iowa for the museum. The party consisted of a number of large, noble savages, beautiful squaws, and interesting papooses. The men gave war dances on the stage with a vigor and enthusiasm that delighted the audiences. Nevertheless, these wild Indians considered their dances as realities, and after their war dances it was dangerous to get in their way, for they went leaping and peering about behind the scenes as though in search of victims for their knives and tomahawks. Indeed, a rope fence had to be built at the front of the stage to make certain that they should not some night plunge down upon their audience after one of their rousing war dances. Finding the responsibility of thus protecting the public to be rather heavy, Mr. Barnum decided to ask them to change their bill by giving a wedding dance instead of a war dance. But the Indians took the wedding dance as seriously as they had the war dance. At the first afternoon performance, Mr. Barnum was informed that he was expected to provide a large new red woolen blanket at a cost of $10 for the bridegroom to present to the father of the bride. He ordered the purchase made, but was considerably taken aback when he was told that he must have another new blanket for the evening's performance, as the old chief would on no account permit that his daughter should be approached with the wedding dance unless he had his blanket as a present. Mr. Barnum undertook to explain to the chief that no blanket was required since this was not a real wedding. The old savage, however, shrugged his shoulders and gave such a terrific "Ugh!" that Barnum was glad to make his peace by ordering another blanket. As they gave 2 performances a day, he was out of pocket $120 for 12 wedding blankets that week. At another time Barnum had at the museum some powerful Indian chiefs who had come on a mission from the West to Washington. Some of these were fine, dignified, splendid types of the race, but one was a wiry little fellow known as Yellow Bear. He was a sly, treacherous, bloodthirsty savage who had killed many whites as they traveled through the far West in early days. But now he was on a mission to the Great Father at Washington, seeking for presents and favors for his tribe, and he pretended to be exceedingly meek and humble, begging to be announced as the "great friend of the white man." He would fawn upon Mr. Barnum and try to convince him that he loved him dearly. In exhibiting these Indians on the stage, Mr. Barnum explained the names and character of each. When he came to Yellow Bear, he would pat him familiarly upon the shoulder, which always caused the old hypocrite to give the most mawkish grin and stroke his arm lovingly. Then, knowing that Yellow Bear did not understand a word he said and thought he was complimenting him, Mr. Barnum would say in the sweetest voice, "This little Indian, ladies and gentlemen, is Yellow Bear, chief of the Kiowas. He has killed, no doubt, scores of white persons, and he is probably the meanest, blackest, hardest radical that lives in the far West." Here Mr. Barnum patted him sweetly on the head, and Yellow Bear, supposing that his introducer was sounding his praises, would smile and fawn upon him and stroke his arm, while the other continued, "If the bloodthirsty little villain understood what I was saying, he would kill me in a moment, but as he thinks I am complimenting him, I can safely state the truth to you, that he is a lying, thieving, treacherous, murderous monster." Here Mr. Barnum gave him another patronizing pat on the head, and Yellow Bear, with a final pleasant smile, bowed to the audience as much as to say that his introducer's words were quite true, and he thanked him for the high praises so generously heaped upon him. Giants and dwarfs were always a great feature of Mr. Barnum's establishment. At different times he had the celebrated dwarfs, General Tom Thumb, Lavinia, and Minnie Warren, Commodore Nutt, and Admiral Dot. In the darkest days of the Civil War he took Commodore Nutt to Washington, and President Lincoln, sad and overburdened, left a cabinet meeting to come out for a moment's relief and joke with the little fellow. Mr. Barnum had also the famous Nova Scotia giantess, Anna Swan, and early in his career a French giant named Monsieur Behin, and the Arabian giant, Colonel Goshen. One day Behin and Goshen had a terrific quarrel. The Arabian called the Frenchman a Shanghai, and the Frenchman called the Arabian a nigger. From words the two were eager to proceed to blows. Running to the collection of arms in the museum, one seized the murderous-looking club with which Captain Cook was said to have been killed, and the other snatched up a crusader's sword of tremendous size and weight. Everything seemed ready for hopeless tragedy, but once again Barnum's quick and ready wit saved the day. Rushing in between the two enormous and raging combatants, he cried, "Look here! This is all right. If you want to fight each other, maiming and perhaps killing one or both of you, that is your affair, but my interest lies here. You are under engagement to me, and if the duel is to come off, I and the public have a right to participate. It must be duly advertised and must take place on our stage. No performance of yours would be a greater attraction." This proposition, apparently made with some earnestness, caused the two huge creatures to burst into laughter, after which dose of healthy humor they were unable longer to retain their anger, but shook hands and quarreled no more. The American Museum was now tremendously successful, and in the year 1849 Mr. Barnum left it under the management of others while he attended to the enterprise, which of all other exhibitions in his life he was most proud. This was the bringing over to America of the famous Swedish singer, Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, as she was called, an enterprise quite different in character from any other that Mr. Barnum had ever undertaken. But he made it, by his genius for awakening public interest, a never-to-be-forgotten success, and Jenny Lind was received everywhere throughout the United States and Cuba with almost riotous attention, while President Fillmore, General Scott, Daniel Webster, and many famous men delighted to pay her homage. Barnum's well-earned success had made him very rich, and the year before Jenny Lind came to America, he had built himself a beautiful home in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he lived. This place is called Iranistan. The house was built in an elegant, airy, oriental style, with domes and slender minarets that looked, when seen by moonlight, like a fairy palace, taken bodily from some Moslem garden across the Bosphorus, and set down there by wizardry amid such different surroundings. At Iranistan he lived with his dearly loved wife and daughters. He was now a very public-spirited man, engaged in all sorts of activities valuable to Bridgeport, always expanding the city, making it more beautiful, and using his means unsparingly for the benefit of the town. He often encountered old fogies who opposed all progress because they had not his far-reaching vision and could not see with him what would be for the final good of the city. But he always managed either to win them over or to get the obstacles they raised out of the way, so that the improvements he intended could be carried through, whether it were a new seaside park or a new bridge across the river. His chief interest was in East Bridgeport, which lay on the opposite side of the river from Bridgeport proper. From pure farmland he turned this region into a thriving city with factories, shops, and houses, and he lent money on very generous terms to workmen who wished to build homes over there. But in order to make East Bridgeport still more prosperous, he once undertook to induce Jerome Clock Company to move there with all its employees and their families. He was assured that this concern was a sound and flourishing one, but its officers deliberately deceived him. In the belief that he was signing notes which should make him responsible for a certain moderate amount of money that he was willing to risk to repay them for moving, he was tricked into signing notes for many, many times more than that amount, until one day he awoke to find that the clock company had failed, and he himself was a ruined man, responsible for their miserable debts to many times more than the amount of all his fortune. Thus, for a stranger concern, with the running of which he had nothing to do, he had lost every penny, and had, besides, a mountain of debts on his back. For all this, moreover, he had been in no way to blame, unless by too great generosity and too honest a faith in human nature. Iranistan had to be given up, and even the American Museum likewise. But in the face of this, his first misfortune, Barnum spent not a moment in complaint, discouragement, or self-pity, although petty enemies hounded him, and many whom he had thought his good friends in his high fortune now turned him a cold shoulder. He set to work at once to rebuild his fortunes, and rejoiced, instead of repining, because this affair had separated for him his real friends from those who had only fawned upon him for what they could get out of him. Tom Thumb was one of his real friends who offered to help him in any way, and after moving his wife and daughters into humble quarters, Barnum set out to exhibit Tom Thumb for a second time in Europe. For 4 years now he worked incessantly, exhibiting various curiosities and lecturing, sending every penny he could earn back home to pay upon his debts. During this time, too, occurred a second misfortune, the burning of beautiful Iranistan to the ground. But Barnum never let anything turn him from his purpose, and so in 1860 he found himself at last free from debt and able to buy back once again his beloved American Museum. When he appeared on the stage of the museum, and it was publicly announced that he was free of his troubles and once again manager there, the public received him with the most tremendous shouts of applause, which showed clearly how they respected him, and how through his years of honest attempts to bring them happiness he had endeared himself to them. Such a huge demonstration of affection nearly broke Barnum down. His voice faltered and tears came to his eyes as he thought what a magnificent conclusion this was to all the trials and struggles of the past 4 years. Soon after Barnum entered again upon his duties at the museum, there came to him a most interesting man, usually known as Grizzly Adams, from the fact that he had captured a great many grizzly bears at the cost of fearful encounters and perils. He was emphatically a man of pluck, and had been for many years a hunter and trapper in the Rockies and Sierra Nevada mountains. He came to New York with his famous collection of California animals captured by himself. These consisted of 20 or 30 immense grizzlies, several wolves, buffalo, elk, and old Neptune, the greatest sea lion of the Pacific. They had come from California on a clipper ship, sailing around Cape Horn. Old Adams had patiently trained these animals, too, and at terrific cost, for although all of them were docile now with him, there was not one of them but at times would give him a sly hit, and some of the bears had struck him so many times with their fearful paws that they had broken his skull. Old Adams was dressed in a hunter's suit of buckskin, trimmed with the skins and bordered with the hanging tails of small Rocky Mountain animals. His cap consisted of the skin of a wolf's head and shoulders, from which depended several tails, and under this his bushy hair and long white beard appeared. In fact, the man was as much of a show as his beasts. Barnum bought a half interest in Adams' menagerie and erected a canvas tent for him. On the morning of his opening, preceded by a band of music, the old man had a fine procession down Broadway and up the Bowery. At the head of a train of cages bearing his animals, he rode on a platform wagon, dressed in his hunting costume, and holding 2 immense grizzly bears by chains, while he sat astride of one larger still, the famous General Fremont. It was General Fremont who had given old Adams the last fatal blow on his head, although he had since become so docile that Adams had used him as a pack bear to carry his cooking and hunting apparatus, and had even ridden on his back for hundreds of miles through the mountains. The old man pluckily insisted on living for months and exhibiting his bears, in spite of his broken skull. In 1861, Barnum heard of some white whales that had been seen in the lower St. Lawrence, and he set out at once to capture one. On a little island in the great river, inhabited by French Canadians, he engaged 24 fishermen to capture for him 2 white whales, alive and unharmed. Scores of these creatures could at times be discovered by their spouting within sight of the island. The men made a V-shaped pen in the water, leaving the broad end open. When the whale got into this pen at high water, the fishermen closed the entrance with their boats, making a tremendous noise and splashing to keep the whale in until low tide. Then the huge creature was left high and dry with too little water to swim in, and so was easily captured. A noose of stout rope was slipped over his tail, and he was thus towed to a large box lined with seaweed and partially filled with salt water. When 2 of these creatures were captured, Barnum went back to New York, sending out word in all directions at what time the whales were to pass through various towns on the line. Thus he drew tremendous crowds to the train to see the creatures. During the Civil War, Barnum was too old to fight, but he sustained his part loyally at home, and in 1865 was elected to the Connecticut legislature. He soon discovered in Hartford that the rich railroad interests had long had undue influence with the legislature and were getting bills passed very advantageous to themselves, but wholly unfair and detrimental to the people. Being no politician, but an honest man, Barnum set himself at once to remedy this evil, defeat the railroad interests, and restore justice to the people. He was making a great speech to this effect in the legislature after weeks of determined work to line up voters against the railroads, a speech intended as his crowning effort to induce the passage of bills that would defeat their unjust schemes, when the following telegram was handed him. Quote, "American Museum in flames, its total destruction certain." Barnum read the telegram containing this terrific news without a sign of discomposure. Then he laid it calmly and coolly on his desk and continued his speech, speaking so logically and eloquently that he carried his point and won the legislation against the railroads. It was not until this was accomplished that he made known the calamity which had befallen him and returned to New York. The destruction of the museum was complete. In a breath had been wiped out the accumulated results of many years of incessant toil. Barnum had lost another fortune. Moreover, he was now 55 years old and might well have thought himself too old to start out life anew, but he did no such thing. He set about at once to establish a new American museum, sending agents all over Europe and America to gather curiosities, and at the end of 4 months he had opened Barnum's New Museum. 3 years later, Mr. Barnum was sitting with his wife and a guest at breakfast one cold winter morning, and carelessly glancing over the newspaper, when he suddenly read aloud, "Hallo! Barnum's museum is burned." "Yes," said his wife, with an incredulous smile, "I suspect it is." He had read the announcement so coolly and with so little excitement that his wife and friend did not believe it, and yet it was true. A third disastrous fire had wiped out his new museum. When he returned to New York he found its ruined walls all frozen over with water from the fire hose, the entire front with its ornamental lamp posts and sign one gorgeous framework of transparent ice that glistened beautifully in the sun. Now at last the celebrated showman decided to retire from active business and live on the remnant of his fortune. He tried hard to content himself with such a life of leisure, traveling about the United States, hunting buffalo with General Custer on the plains of Kansas, and for several years endeavoring in every way to amuse himself. But this experience only showed him that a life of inactivity was absolutely unendurable. He decided conclusively, once and for all, that the only true rest is to be found in useful activity, and by 1870 he had bigger plans than ever. He now determined to devote himself entirely to a great traveling circus, far larger and better than anything that had ever been done before. On this circus he labored unremittingly, confident that if he devoted his best energies to the public would liberally repay him. Perceiving that his show was too gigantic to be moved in the old way by wagons, he now for the first time arranged with railroads to transport it, using 70 freight cars, 6 passenger cars, and 3 engines. The circus was a tremendous success. People crowded to the various places of exhibition, coming not only from the towns where the show was held, but from neighboring towns as well, some on excursion trains, and some by wagons or on horseback, often camping out overnight. 2 years later, on the day before Christmas, Barnum was sitting at breakfast in a hotel, thinking comfortably how he had arranged for his circus to be shown in New York in order that his vast host of men should not be thrown out of employment during the winter, when once again a telegram was handed him saying that a fourth fire had completely destroyed this circus. This time Barnum had no thought of giving up again. He had decided beyond a shadow of a doubt that there were no real misfortunes in the world, and that what seemed even an overwhelming misfortune was only an opportunity for rising to greater accomplishments. Therefore he merely interrupted his breakfast long enough on this occasion to go out and send immediate cables to his European agents to duplicate all his animals within 2 months. He then went back and finished his meal. By the 1st of April he placed on the road a combination of curiosities and marvels far surpassing anything he had ever done before. But great as this circus was, Barnum was never satisfied to rest on his laurels. He aimed to do something greater still. In 1874, while he still continued the traveling circus, he opened in New York a great Roman hippodrome. This gorgeous spectacle began every evening with a Congress of Nations, a grand procession of gilded chariots and triumphal cars, conveying kings, queens, and emperors, each surrounded by his respective retinue, and all in costumes made with the greatest care to be historically correct. This vast pageant contained nearly 1,000 persons and several hundred horses, beside elephants, camels, llamas, ostriches, elands, zebras, and reindeer. The rich and varied costumes, armor, and trappings, gorgeous banners and paraphernalia, as well as the appropriate music accompanying the entrance of each nation, produced an effect at once brilliant and bewildering. The entire press said that never before since the days of the Caesars had there been so grand and interesting a public spectacle. Most of Mr. Barnum's competitors in the circus field in those early days were men of very inferior aims and abilities, content with poor and inferior, even vulgar shows, aiming only to make money, and inspired with little of that desire to give, in the biggest sense, the best and finest entertainment possible, which made Mr. Barnum so different from the others. But in 1880 he found a rival worthy of his mettle in the person of Mr. James A. Bailey. The very moment that Mr. Barnum perceived Mr. Bailey to be a man with the same big aims and ambitions as himself, as well as the same solid business sense, Far from feeling any jealousy and trying to drive him out of the field, he entered at once into negotiations with him and took him into partnership. This partnership with Bailey lasted throughout the remainder of Barnum's life. They opened their combined show with a street parade by night in New York, all beautifully illumined by calcium lights. This huge circus now, when it traveled, had its own cars. No longer were the trains hired as of old from the railways. Advance agents and advertising cars, gorgeous with paint and gilding, containing paste vats, posters, and a force of men, would pass through the country weeks ahead of the circus, pasting up the billboards and arousing the interest of the community. The circus itself was packed up in the smallest possible space, its men trained with military promptitude and precision to work like clockwork and make every move count in erecting or taking down the huge canvas city. The performers slept in their cars and ate in the canvas dining tent. Hundreds of men were employed, and the expenses of the concern were $4,000 or $5,000 a day. One of the most interesting feats of Barnum's later years was the purchase of Jumbo, the largest elephant ever seen. Jumbo was the chief ornament of the Zoological Gardens in London, and a great favorite with Queen Victoria, whose children and grandchildren were among the thousands of British youngsters who had ridden on Jumbo's back. Mr. Barnum never supposed that Jumbo could be purchased. Nevertheless, he made a liberal offer for him to the superintendent of the gardens, and his offer was accepted. When it became publicly known that Jumbo had been sold and was to depart for America, a great hue and cry was raised in England. Newspapers talked of Jumbo before all the news of the day, and children wrote supplicating letters to the superintendent, begging that he be retained. Nevertheless, the superintendent persisted, and Jumbo had to go. When the day of his departure arrived, there came a great tug of war. As the agents tried to remove Jumbo, Alice, another elephant who had been for 16 years Jumbo's companion and was called, in fun, his wife, grew so excited that her groans and trumpetings frightened all the other beasts in the zoo, who set up such howlings and roarings as were heard a mile away. Midst such a grievous farewell, Jumbo was led forth into the street. But when the great beast found himself in such unfamiliar surroundings, there awoke in his breast that timidity which is so marked a feature of the elephant's character. He trumpeted with alarm and turned to re-enter the garden, only to find the gates of his paradise closed. Thereupon he straightway lay down on the pavement and would not budge an inch. His cries of fright sounded to the uninitiated like cries of grief, and attached a huge crowd of sympathizers, many of them in tears. Persuasion had no effect in inducing Jumbo to rise, and force was not permitted, for Mr. Barnum always insisted strictly that his animals be governed by kindness, not by cruelty. And indeed it would have been a puzzle what force to apply to so huge a creature as Jumbo. In dismay, Mr. Barnum's agent sent him the following cable: Jumbo has lain down in the street and won't get up. What shall we do? Barnum immediately replied, let him lie there a week if he wants to. It is the best advertisement in the world. After 24 hours, however, the gates of the garden were reopened and Jumbo permitted to go in again. Barnum's agents now decided to take the huge beast in another way. A great cage on wheels was provided and moved up close to the door of Jumbo's den. When the elephant had been induced to enter the cage, the door was closed and the cage was dragged by 20 horses to a waiting steamer where quarters had been prepared for Jumbo by cutting away one of the decks. Thus he was brought to America, and later Mr. Barnum acquired Alice likewise. In 1884, Mr. Barnum got the rarest specimen of all his zoo, a royal sacred white elephant from Burma. The animal was not pure white as had been supposed in Europe, but was grayish. No European monarch had ever succeeded in getting one of these elephants into a Christian country, for the Siamese and Burmese people believed that if a sacred white elephant left their country, some dire misfortune would come upon them. Barnum's agents many months before had purchased a white elephant, but on the eve of its departure, its attendant priests gave it poison rather than permit it to fall into Christian hands. Finally, however, after 3 years of patient persistence, diplomacy, and tact, as well as an outlay of $250,000, Barnum succeeded through his agents in getting from King Thibaw at Mandalay in Burma Tung Talung. He came to America in all his gorgeous trappings, accompanied by a Burmese orchestra and retinue of Buddhist priests in full ecclesiastical costume. Mr. Barnum built for his great show enormous winter quarters at Bridgeport. A 10-acre lot was enclosed, and in this enclosure numerous buildings were constructed. There was an elephant house, kept heated at just the right temperature naturally required by these animals, where 30 or 40 elements could be luxuriously housed and trained. Another building held lions, tigers, and leopards, which require a different temperature, and still another housed camels and caged animals. The monkeys had roomy quarters all to themselves, where they could roam about and work their mischievous will unrestrained. The hippopotami and sea lions had a huge pond heated by steam pipes, and here the elephants also were permitted their supreme enjoyment, a bath. There was a nursery department for the receipt and care of newborn animals, and in the various buildings many of the beasts were permitted to leave their cages and frolic at large. In 1887, when Barnum was fast asleep in the middle of the night, a telegram arrived stating that a fifth great fire had totally destroyed these splendid winter quarters. His wife awoke him at 2 o'clock in the morning and told him of the telegram. "I am very sorry, my dear," he said calmly, "but apparent evils are often blessings in disguise. It is all right." And with that he rolled back into his original comfortable position and in 3 minutes was once again fast asleep. Barnum was now 77 years old, but with the help of his partner, Mr. Bailey, he rose as triumphant from this last fire as from all the others, and soon he had a better circus than ever. To the end of his days, his energy, pluck, and healthy ambition gave the people a better, completer, and cleaner performance than has ever been given by any other showman. With his kindly face beaming, he often said, "To me there is no picture so beautiful as 10,000 smiling, bright-eyed, happy children; no music so sweet as their clear, ringing laughter. That I have had power, year after year, by providing innocent amusement for the little ones, to create such pictures, to evoke such music, is my proudest and happiest reflection." End of section 5.